I have the honor of introducing the next act, it's my great pleasure to say that David Rothenberg and Stephen Nachmanovitch are going to share with us an hour-long presentation that is both music, played music, and discussion as well, and they are both coming from a background of working with interspecies communication, art, explorations of playing with birds and bugs and insects and whales, and learning about how communication happens between human beings and the larger ecology. David's a professor of philosophy at New Jersey Institute of Technology and has written a lot of books and made a lot of recordings with animals. And Stephen is a graduate of Harvard, been doing improv and plays violin and got his PhD from my father. He's been working with questions of what might art tell us about the possibilities for survival. And I've known him most of my life. So it's a great pleasure to introduce both of them. And I'm not going to say more than that because we need the time to dive in and to enjoy this presentation. So I'm hoping that that it's queued up and ready to go. And let's take a look. After the session, we'll have some open gallery time for discussion.
Well, it's great to be here with the biosemiotics folks. I guess the theme that we're all interested in is how the living world is constantly talking to itself.
Yes, and I believe I've been to this conference in person once in Tartu and met a lot of people, and we even turned that into a book, a whole anthology of all the talks from that conference. And actually, at that event, I met many people who later I collaborated with over the years. So it was a kind of formative experience, and I'm happy to be back. I wish we were there in person, but the world is no longer in person. The semiotics of communication has moved into the virtual sphere, and we're stuck in it. This is the real world, muchachos, and we are in it.
We are indeed. So that brings me to a statement by Dogen in Japan in the 13th century, who said that, he said, whoever told people that mind means thoughts, opinions, ideas, and concepts. Mind means trees, fence posts, tiles, and grasses.
It does. And animals and their sounds.
Yes.
And if you think of these sounds as music, they are immediately far more accessible to us, because we can understand music when we have no idea what's going on. It's not something you have to translate. You just have to feel your way into it.
Yes, and translating itself, I'm thinking, if we were actually with you in person, all together in the old way. I've been to so many conferences in places like Germany and Japan where everyone else has been, they've allowed me to give my talk in English, but everyone else was so compassionate as to have spent years learning English in school, so that I and a few other people could give our talks in English. But meanwhile, I'd be sitting there in the audience listening to talks in German or Japanese or whatever the language might be. And I'd be quite delighted not to be able to, in quotes, understand what was being said, because I was interested in the music of the sound. And every once in a while, sort of like dolphins or flying fish jumping out of the sea, there might be a word or phrase that I understood or a name that I recognized. And I started latching these things together and forming some idea. But the ideas were of not much consequence compared to the music of the sound and the flow of the syllables. Kind of like listening to Finnegan's Wake in the car, which I was doing the other day.
Was it read by the author?
No, it was not. There's a couple of recordings of small bits read by the author on scratchy old recordings, but there's a brand new recording of the complete Finnegan's Wake that just came out last week for Bloomsday, published by Naxos, read by a couple of wonderful Irish actors. And it's a wonderful thing to be driving your car to the post office or the grocery store and be able to have the syllables of Finnegan's Wake babbling and flowing along, latching onto your brain here and there, latching onto your muscles here and there, to your bloodstream.
Yeah, we forget that when writing was invented, it was just shorthand for something you had to read aloud. There was no such thing as silent reading. The words on the page were only there to be turned into sound. Isn't that so much easier than talking? Isn't that so much more immediate than explaining, than trying to qualify and explain what you're talking about?
To qualify and quantify.
What kind of music did Dogen play? He must have been a musician.
He must have been. And of course, nobody knows. So in those lacunae, we can guess. We can guess. So the lacunae or lacunae or whatever you call them in English, that's the bulk of every communication. You know, T.S. Eliot said, each word is a step to the block down the tree's throat. And even when we're supposedly making sense in denotative speech, which is really a tiny, tiny fraction of human communication, let alone the communication of the rest of nature, there are these enormous holes between each of my words, between my words and your words. Even people who are close friends can communicate partially with all of these gaps. And we fill in the gaps with habit, with imagination, with the tissue of perception and projection and introjection and all of those wonderful Freudian things. So the words, the so-called meaning, they're just a little bit. They're just a little narrow sliver on top of communication, just as notated music is a little narrow sliver on top of the totality of music that people have made throughout the world.
Yeah, this is a perfect segue to something you probably weren't expecting, which is this piece that I wanted to play for you and figure out what you would add to it, that comes out of a conversation I had with Dan Stoll, a guy who should be at this conference. He is the creator of this app called Warbler that in Europe identifies bird songs. It hears a bird song, it can tell you what it is. How does it work? Well, it's a bit of a secret, of course, like a proprietary app kind of secret, but I know for a fact that it picks up on the rhythms of bird songs, the spaces between the sounds, more than the actual pitches or things that humans might notice. And I was talking to him in an online conversation, and he said, like, oh, you know, I would really like to hear the rhythms of bird songs turned into like electronic sounds. So not the pitches transposed and moved around like we usually do, but the rhythms turned into like electronic music, which he said, electronic music rhythms are usually too boring, but bird rhythms are really interesting.
Yes,
so I said, okay, that's a good challenge. I'll make that for you, Dan. Hope you're listening, Dan. And so I picked the sedge warbler, a common bird in Sweden, not in the United States, but it can't be found.
We're going to segue to the sedge warbler.
So the sedge warbler is fast, I'm warning you. The rhythms of the sedge warblers here are turned into sounds. I don't even have to add anything to this, but let's see what you do and what happens. Here we go. So that's a little secret from the world of bird songs. If
That's
you can turn it
fabulous.
into
I
like
can't wait to hear it.
Morse
to see
code
his app.
and kind of like the rhythms might include the secrets of how to tell one from another. If you want to tell one from another, because as we all know, hearing is forgetting the name of the thing one hears.
Yes.
Take that, biosemiotics. Is that a good idea or not?
So when I was getting ready to do this and warming up the instruments, I had one of the few genuine interspecies dialogues that I've had. I mean, we've done a lot of playing with recorded bird song and playing with live birds, live animals, with some sense or possibly the hope of the communication being two-way. But my grandson, Ernie, whom I'm babysitting today, he is 71% beagle. And it has happened every once in a while that I would be down here in my studio and he would be up there on the stairs in the upper part of the house, and he'd hear me play the violin and he would start singing along. And he was do this thing which wasn't quite barking and wasn't quite howling, but was really singing along. And I've never been able to figure out after the fact what I did that set him off. But today I was able to go upstairs and I was like playing at the foot of the staircase. It was like I was Romeo and he was Juliet, and we were having a dialogue up to the balcony and really singing back and forth to each other. And I've occasionally had that experience with dogs. And it's clear that it's possible to have a two-way conversation with animals where some kind of meaning is being passed back and forth.
Yeah, you know, I spend a lot of time listening to underwater pond sounds.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find out what's going on beneath the surface, where there's this strange mix of plants and animals, rhythms and noises. And usually I stick the hydrophone in the water and plug it into a speaker, and I just listen. Sometimes I play along, and usually, you know, that's what's happening. But I tried this at a lake called Lake Owasting the other day, and I plugged in this speaker, and right after the sound started to come from beneath the surface, this duck arrived from the distance, flying at an incredible speed, like, and just landed in the water, climbed up out of the water, and sat next to the speaker singing along. Like, I was so speechless. I couldn't believe this, that I did not film it or record it. I said, I can't believe this. So we're going to play these pond sounds and see who sings along to this. You imagine you were a duck and you heard this. What would it make you do?
So speaking of pond scum, I've been really fascinated lately reading about the research about the mycorrhizal networks that connect trees and all this wonderful stuff. Gregory Basin would have loved to have been alive to see this research, where trees in the forest are talking each other through nutrients, through the fungi or fungi or however you pronounce them. And there's a whole network of communication going on with water and nutrients as the medium of communication. And so as I've been reading about this, I was thinking, well, there really should be a field of phytosemiotics. And then, of course, 5 seconds visit to the shrine of St. Google revealed that phytosemiotics has been written about since 1981. And in fact, Don Favreau wrote a review of the book. So it's in the air.
Yeah, I was just talking the other day to Monica Gagliano. She is a scientist who studies the kind of language of plants, but not just on their own, but how they talk to her. And her whole research was transformed when the coral reefs talked to her and said, no, you don't want to study us anymore. You have to study these other things. And she got in a lot of trouble for this, writing a book, a very personal book, where the sort of semiotics of the plant world was speaking to her. And she's asking the subject of her research, what are you telling me? How am I supposed to study you? Which is either the way all science works or exactly what you're not supposed to do. And so I really wanted to hear what she thought about this pond music, So I sent her some, and I said, look, I'm trying to find the rhythms in these ponds, like the rhythms in these birds, what they're going to tell me. And she said, yeah, this is great what you're doing. You found a way for nature to talk to you. I wish I had found that. All my work is struggling to find that. That's why I'm a scientist. I haven't found it, she said, which is very surprising because I thought she sort of had found it. And with the interconnectedness of trees and plants, that is this kind of thing I've sort of been dreaming of for a while. Like when we look out, we see leaves, we see a tree, we see a bird. That maybe nature doesn't see those things. It just sees relationships, shades, colors, connections, and the first principles are something else.
Exactly. Yes. Relationships.
Yeah, and that we just don't, we're talking about it all in this human way, scientists always accuse people like Monica who start to get less scientific, or people who play music with birds and say, look, the bird is responding to me. They're saying, this is all just subjective. It's all human things. You wish all this stuff was happening for you. And to which you can say, yeah, you wish nature was written in the mathematical language like Galileo said. Like, that's just a human way of looking at things, turning it all into numbers, statistics, It could all be
Of course, the numbers
music.
and the statistics are present in the geometry of the rose, and they're present in the geometry of the caterpillar. And there's so much. I mean, here we are with the famous, Mr. Pythagoras, where if I divide this string in half, it wiggles twice as fast, and that's what we call an octave in the West. And things like the overtone series are built into the basic structure of the universe. And that's all mathematics, and the link between aesthetics and mathematics is very, very profound. To me, art and science, William Blake, who had a lot to say about the Umwelt, by the way, Blake said, the sun's light when he unfolds it depends on the organ that beholds it. And Blake said, as the eye, such the object. So Blake talked about how art and science, a single enterprise, cannot exist but by naked beauty displayed. And when he said naked beauty, he meant data. He meant really seeing what's out there. And art and science are one in the sense that they are the search for more and more data and the search for patterns in the data and the search for better, clearer perception. The place where they diverge is replicability. Like if you list the features of the scientific method, they're really all the same as the artistic method, except one is reversed. So in science, results need to be replicable so that I find out what I find out here in Charlottesville, Virginia, and somebody in Estonia finds something, and we need to know that they're finding the same thing. Whereas in art, the subjectivity of the perception is primary, and the things that make your perception unique and different from mine are exactly what's most interesting about them.
Yeah, once a band I was in was invited onto this radio station to talk about music, and then the radio show host said, who would you most like to jam with from history, your group, And the drummer said, oh, definitely Pythagoras.
Yeah.
So our next piece is called Jamming with Pythagoras.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah, right. It's hard to really imagine what it would be like to jam with Pythagoras. I mean,
Whoever he or she was.
right? We sort of imagine it was the world of austere rules and regimentation, but maybe they were all like dancing wildly around the fire and being kind of Dionysian craziness and making the philosophy come right out of the flames of the scream. Everything all at once. I'm sure we don't have the ancient Greeks figured out, just like we don't have the birds, the pond creatures, and anything really figured out. What they're doing could always be the opposite of what we think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the language of primary process. We hope to translate the language of primary process into secondary process so it can come out in words and concepts.
Okay,
But we
here
can't.
I have a biosemiotic example here. This is famous from biosemiotics and zoomusicology, the notion of deep mysteries and structure hidden in the song of the Eurasian skylark. People have examined this bird song. It's so complicated and fluttery, and when you slow it down, you find all these mysterious things, but the biosemiotics, is full of critique, and the critics of this say you're just finding artifacts, you're just finding things that are not there, you're getting caught inside the technology, you're hearing things that your machines reveal and they're not really there. So let's just see whether you think they're really there. We take a skylark and we transform him and see what happens. And
That's
then
an
you hear that
incredible bird.
sound, and you're singing in midair, and
That's an incredible
why?
bird.
What's it doing? And then how are we supposed to understand that with all of our tools and signs and symbols? You hear this, you witness it. What do you do? How do you make sense of it? That's the essence of biosemiotics right there. Humanity, nature, sign, symbol. How do we make sense of that which is being sung not for us?
Not for us. We're
Maybe
just
it's
a
all for
little
us. Maybe
part
we
of
are
it.
here
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
here we are, folks. So we'll be talking live.
Yes, thank you
Okay.
for listening to this. Basically a live presentation. We've just prepared it live for you. We're not going to edit this. This is what we did. And now we're going to talk about it. So thanks a lot.
I'm now in Charlottesville, Virginia, and David is in Estonia. And we decided to pre-record this before he left the country so that we would be less likely to have technical snafus. But of course, we had a technical snafu anyway with those wonderful gray bars and, you know.
What gray bars? What
gray-
gray bars? Were there gray bars? I didn't see any.
Yes. So we'd love to open it up to questions and discussion and anything that's on your mind.
I'm reading the chat here.
I just want to say it was awesome. Thanks for the performance. It was really something else. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. You made my night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sorry about these gray bars. I don't know what they are because I didn't see them. How did it sound? Did the sound work?
Sound worked great.
That's good.
Yeah.
So I just have to tell you that my dog, whose name happens to be Blake, was speaking and singing along.
That's after you heard the word Blake.
Yes,
Yeah.
Blake. That's Blake for you.
Yeah.
Hi, Mats.
So maybe a question here, because I have heard David, doing music together with birds and other sounds of nature for rather long time now. Could you briefly describe this, say, evolution, your own evolution in this, has there been sort of real, deepening of understanding during these decades? You're doing something like 3 decades of already. Of this.
Must be something like that. I mean, I started doing it. I mean, when I was a little kid, when my family moved out of New York City to Connecticut, then I took long walks in the woods and was listening to sounds and just thought it was kind of interesting. And then when I was in high school, I heard there was a local musician named Paul Winter, who apparently was famous for playing music with whales and birds and wolves. And he lived pretty close to me, so I got to know him. And then I learned that you could do this. And then I thought, oh, I want to join your band. And all of his musicians says, you do not want to join this band, believe me. You do not want to do that. Start your own. And then I thought about that, but I really didn't get interested in it again until I met a kind of another senior figure, the Canadian composer R. Murray Schafer, author of a famous book called Tuning of the World. He was a composer who brought whole orchestras out into the wilderness to perform operas that he composed and things like that, as well as writing this book about listening to the sounds of the environment. When he turned 60, there was a conference celebrating his life and work. And there I met many people who were playing music with different creatures. And I thought, maybe you could do this. And one of them was Michael Pestle, an art professor at Chatham College. And he invited me to the National Aviary in Pittsburgh, where I started playing with birds there. And then I said, you know, there really is something interesting here. I should pursue this. And then I went more into it. I think in recent years, what I've done most differently is get more other people involved that it shouldn't be about me and some kind of story about the solo quest to interact with the world, but to get a group of people, what happens when they play with the sounds of nature for the very first time. That's what we did in this film, Nightingales in Berlin, that I did a few years ago. There's also a book about that. And what I continue to do is bring more people together into this process. And that's how I got back together with Stephen Nachmanovitch, who I sort of consider to be my twin. Like, we just think the same way. We have the same artworks and musical scores on our walls. And I think maybe he's a little older than me, but otherwise we're the same. We finish each other's sentences. And so he put out an album of bird-related music during the pandemic. I said, hey, let's do one together. Let's just record it online. And we spent days doing this. And then we spent even more days talking about it, and produced this book in a matter of months, From This World Another, which is a record of us talking about this music that we released. Because what can you do? Music comes today without any information, without any discussion or liner notes like it used to. So we decided to talk through the music. And that's, another experiment from the pandemic period of expanding this idea of connecting to nature and also connecting other people along with it. So I hope my work in this area has evolved, and I think it's evolved more recently in not being centered around me and nature, but around we and nature, and being willing to see what other people come up with and learn from their approaches.
Nature is we. Ilgen, you had a question?
Hello, thank you. I've been following the conference since yesterday, and I'm really reading about biosemiotics very recently. So forgive my ignorance with this question. And I'm a poet, so I can be like messing around a little. My question will be on the relationship between semiotics and freedom, and how it might tie up to biosemiotics. So I tried to listen to the whole recording without minding the linguistic directions of it, but as a sonic entity as a whole. And Nachmanovich's voice was coming from a peak down through the slopes of a mountain range, while Rothenberg's voice was turning into a web of hallways in a big building that are connected to each other while he was talking. And then
Wonderful.
when you actually started to play your instruments, what I realized was that the whereabouts where you merged together were unusual, mostly ethereal planes and states I have no particular vocabulary for, just a cluster of thoughts and sensations. So the question is all communication semiotic or biosemiotic? And communication, I use it for the lack of a better word. What I mean by it is an open, interactive process of connectivity. Does the semiotic necessarily reframe this connectivity or not? And when it does so, does it annihilate its freedom? Thank you.
How are we supposed to answer that?
That's a
Where's
big one.
Pythagoras and Blake when we need them?
Well, I'll say your question immediately reminded me of a line from a Bob Dylan song where he says, "Ah, my friends from the prison, they ask unto me, how good does it feel to be free? And I answer them most mysteriously, our birds free from the chains of the skyway." So here we are. When we do music, I mean, David and I are both longtime improvisers. And that means, of course, there's no preparation and no discussion and no nothing. We just play and listen respectfully to each other. And structure emerges from what happens that day, that moment, that second. And so in a sense, it's all you know, the conversational flowing of unpredictable sound that's never been made before. And certainly some of the sounds that we made in this little performance today have never been made before and will never be made again. Just as the sentences that we say have never been made before and will never be made again. But at the same time, each of us is sitting on top of 3.5 billion years of organic evolution, which is pattern upon pattern upon pattern upon pattern upon pattern. And we're all, my teacher, Gregory Bateson, liked to talk about how the structure of you as a living organism enables you to appreciate the structure of a piece of art that you're looking at or a piece of art that you're making. So that it's all, in a sense, you know, he talked about how form is secreted from process. So a snail secretes its shell simply by living and growing and moving around. And we secrete our music, or we secrete the furniture that we make, or the art that we make, or the plumbing pipes we build, or whatever our craft or trade is. And so, yes, that's all semiotic in a sense. And it's all non-semiotic, because the more you investigate it, the thinner the lines come between these concepts. And the more the lines between the concepts disappear, the more enjoyable it is to participate in the actual creation of ideas and art and conversation.
David and Stephen, thank you so much. We had yesterday a couple of presentations on beauty and aesthetics. And I think, Stephen, what you were just talking about really relates to sort of this synesthetic immediacy that, yes, you can probe it forever and get lost in the probing, but the experience and to take it in for what it is and what it does, sort of its effect on the organism, I think is one of these sort of key concepts that we keep on circling around, and which your performances sort of, especially the sort of ones with the music of other species, really brings us to, because there's something about the immediacy of other species sounds and sounding and their patterns and frequencies that are unmistakably aesthetic in a non-symbolic way. Whereas in, say, Western classical music, you know, we have certain ideas that, well, you know, when Bach was doing this, he was signaling this thing, and, you know, that there were certain tropes that were being used in a more symbolic way. But my name's Yogi Henlin, and I'm a drummer. I'm a percussionist, a handpan player, a hung player. And while I haven't really played so much music with other species, I did have a question about rhythm. So the Siberian skylark, for example, or Eurasian skylark, the rhythms, it seemed like that there was a punctuation, right? You'd have something that you could possibly loop, but then it would break into this whole other sort of tempo and tact, right? This whole other meter. And so I'm wondering how you deal with this, because a lot of the playing that the two of you were doing in accompaniment in the compositions was sort of, I think of it as, you know, briefly sort of ghost noting different rhythms without, say, falling into, say, something that like Steve Coleman, right, with M-bass, you could say is 17/8 or something like that, and looping, or having these polyrhythmic looping structures. So how do you see the lack of rhythmic repetition in natural sounds working, because our music is so structured around these closed cycles, you could say. So I'm really curious what you both have to say about that.
Well, one of my favorite composers, and certainly the one who was most influenced by birds, was Olivier Messiaen. And he liked to talk about what he called non-retrogradable rhythms, which were rhythms, as you described, that don't fit into the boxes of meters, of mathematically defined meters, can't be turned around. They have to go the way they go. And listening to birds, I mean, just walking down the trail here this morning, hearing cardinals calling and crows cawing and the vultures cawing, I heard so many rhythmic utterances, but none of them, you know, a bird might do 5 utterances now, and then 15 seconds later do 7, and then 15 seconds later do 2. And there's certainly repetition and rhythm of a sort, but it's not the kind that fits into the geometrically defined box that we like to structure Western music around. So, of course, when you're an improviser and you're respectfully listening to nature, or you're respectfully listening to your human partner who's a different personality from you and has different ideas, and some of your ideas merge and some of them don't, then you get these wonderfully complex structures that can't be really described or quantified, but which are nevertheless structures and which have the kind of wholeness that a body has.
You know, although it's true that, you know, a lot of human music has a regular beat behind it and regular rhythms from a small group that we often recognize, 4/4 and 3/4, 6/8. Most of the world's music doesn't have that. It's actually free and loose and changes in tempo and speed. And you know, we shouldn't forget that. There's so much music people are doing. They just make a sound, and, you know, songs calling cows in the Swedish mountains. And then, you know, you have whole music based on that. It's uneven, you know, but there's rhythm to it. It's just not a steady beat. And I think people, you know, most of my students, if I teach a music class, let's make some music, just make some sounds. How do we know if it's music? The first thing they say is, it's got to have a beat. It's got to have a steady beat. And then one of the first things I try and teach them is, it's not really true. You could change it. And actually, it's so much more interesting if you quickly change it away from the familiar. Like, people often say, my music's, you know, it sounds too boring. Why does it all sound the same? Just make a piece in 7. You just make the tempo change. You know, it's going to be more interesting right away. That's one thing we can learn from these birds. And, you know, the pond sounds we heard were a mixture of rhythms, kind of uneven but repeating ones, and occasional, and that's kind of plant versus animal in the ponds. The plants make all these regular overlapping beats. And I was, just as Stephen in our video talks about, well, you know, there's this whole kind of plant semiotics. I was amazed to discover it. Just yesterday, I was amazed to discover there's 3 giant scientific anthologies on the rhythms of plants. None of them discuss this pond rhythms I'm talking about, but there's a whole vast field studying rhythm in plants, and it's mostly about how they grow. Different things happen over different amounts of time. But you read some of these articles, they do use these musical analogies. Like, scientists are reaching for the notion of, when they say rhythm, when they decide to study the rhythms of plants, they're looking for some kind of regularity. But I think they know that the regularity mixes with the irregular, and that's something that nature has, that when we try and calculate things, we you know, we can miss it if we try and make it too regular. That was the example with the sedge warbler turned into electronic sounds like this guy who's an electronic music fan and an expert on calculating the qualities of bird sound so that an app can identify them. He said, I've heard all this music. It's too boring. The beat is too regular in these clubs and festivals. Why can't we learn from the birds and make rhythm from their rhythms? And I said, okay, let's try around and play around with that. I think all of that is helpful for people trying out to expand their notion of what music can be, which is the basic reason I got interested in music and nature sounds, to expand the sense of what music could be.
Yeah.
I mean, to get back to Hilgen's question about, where is the freedom? There was always going to be an element of freedom and an element of structure that contains it, right? The structure is the scaffolding that holds it in some kind of positioning, but there's always the elements of creativity that are built into that, and the two are blended together. And how that all happens can vary so much between different forms of art, depending on what the source of structure is and what the source of creativity is. So in poetry, for example, you may have like a rhythmic pattern. Certainly in music with lyrics, you have a rhythmic pattern, and then you have to sort of fit the lyrics into that pattern so that you can understand what the lyrics are saying at the same time that you're appreciating the melody.
Yeah, I found what's so interesting watching this presentation that we made, and then I haven't paid attention to since, is that we talk with each other and then we kind of communicate musically. Is the music also like a talking? I always remember John Cage saying, what I don't like about jazz and improvisation is music becomes like a dialogue, becomes like talking back and forth. He didn't like that. He wanted the music to be something else. So when I watched our performance, I thought like, oh, are we trying to talk with music here, or are we doing something else? And I don't know the answer, but I suspect we're doing something else, that using music to dialogue with isn't the same as talking when you leave space for the other person to speak, that together you make some sounds. You don't quite know what the meanings are going to be exactly. And the great thing about music is you can get some meaning out of it with having no idea what's going on. You don't need to learn all that theory or know what the instruments are or what culture the musicians are from. That might help you, but it might not. Like the music cuts through, which is one reason you can play music with somebody, say from New Guinea, who might not speak your language. You can get together and make music that makes some kind of sense. So maybe you can also do that with animals who are making music for very complex reasons that we tend to oversimplify, but maybe they understand the connection of sound because they're playing around with sound. Anyone who pays attention to birds or whales or bugs know that they interact with sound without necessarily thinking about what that sound is. They respond. So it is one way to cut through the fact that we don't know what they're talking about, to make music with them. Music is not a language. It's some other kind of way to communicate.
And the thing is that language isn't even a language. I mean, I remember so many times when my sons were in school and they'd be like in 8th or 9th grade or something, and they'd have an English teacher who would assign a poem, and the teacher said, well, what did the poet mean by this line? So here's a line in English poetry, and it's treated as though it was a code for something else, and that your job as the reader is to decode it and write down the real meaning, And of course, Isadora Duncan said, if I could say it, I wouldn't have to dance it. But the writer also, if he or she could say it, he or she wouldn't have to write it. And I remember one day there was a novel, what was it? David Mitchell's The Bone Clocks. And I had just finished it and I really enjoyed it. And I was trying to describe to my family, my wife said, well, what is it about? So of course, I made a complete fool of myself. Well, it's about this woman named Holly Sykes, and then this happens and that. Well, of course, what is it about is meaningless. So what I learned, the thing that suddenly hit me when I realized what a fool I was making of myself trying to describe what a novel is about, is that not only can't you describe music in words or painting in words, you can't even describe words in words.
And yet we keep trying.
And yet we keep trying. Why not? Give it a shot, But the pleasure of doing improvisational music or any other art form is that the pressure is off in terms of definitions, and the pleasure is on in terms of simply being there and listening to each other and responding without worrying about what it means or what it says. And the less you worry about that, the more together it becomes. I was once in a conference in Ireland that was full of like neuroscientists and linguists and psychologists. And at the end, we were like sitting, the presenters were sitting at one of these long tables, which is called a panel of wood. And so the question that was being passed down the line was, what's the source of human creativity? So various people had whatever was their favorite part of the brain that year, or various cognitive processes and so on. And then when it got to me, I said, the source of creativity is other people.
Do you think musicians are more likely to say that than other kinds of artists or creators?
I think creators of all kinds are interested in community and paying attention to each other and learning from each other. Musicians do have this wonderful process of doing something that's nonverbal and immediate, and where you're able to pile on top of each other and not have to do the turn taking. You can do some turn taking, but it's got this sort of more integrative thing, which is sort of like, I'm just noticing my hand here, and the parts of the hand that are the so-called nervous system and the so-called circulatory system and the bones and the muscles and the tendons and the fascia, they aren't like taking turns in order to wiggle my fingers around, They're all doing it. It's all one.
And yet, the context of live performance, right, is different in fundamental ways, or recording in a studio versus recording otherwise. I mean, but the live performance and the active interaction with an audience, there's a lot of magic there.
Yeah.
I'm reminded, if I may, of Robert Frost saying that we all dance around in a circle and suppose, and the secret sits in the middle and knows. To your example about, I visualize musicians or dancers, and it's only by virtue of all of them doing their actions together that in this middle, the supposed, empty space, something actually knows.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. If this were a live performance and we had those gray bars coming down, we would find ways to crawl under them and around them and incorporate the gray bars into something.
Were they moving these gray bars? Did
they moved a little bit.
But did they cover up the whole video?
They covered up about a third of you.
Oh, I see.
And then sometimes it went all the way down to cover up your name below, and then sometimes it popped up.
Interesting.
Sort of halfway, And I mean, it sort of looked like what they used to use in the 50s to cover pornographic material or something like
Yeah,
that.
it was being censored. What was going on was instantly being censored by the internet.
That's right. That's right. So anybody else who would like to chime in? Yes.
Somebody's out there.
Okay, I'll chime in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So when we were talking about abductive process yesterday, there was a moment in the morning when I was talking about Gregory's way of looking at abductive process as the way one context describes another, which is a really interesting kind of approach to look at it through. I'm interested in this notion of description that's happening here. And description somehow being in that tissuing process between the gaps. And the richness of that description, of course, is coming from those many millennia of life and those patterns that have been overlapping and intersteeping and interweaving and moiraying into each other and fusing and stewing and brewing and fermenting. And I guess one of the things that I find so interesting is, and I noticed this, I think really first it hit me the hardest when I was making the film about Gregory. And I was confronted with this very difficult question of how do you describe a living organism? And not to mention, it could be your father. But any living organism, how do you describe something that is alive without killing it? Without having the description isolated out of its potentiality of gaps that can be continually retissued into that richness of abductive process. And there's this moment, I love this quote that I'm gonna mess up a little bit of Gregory's, where he says, poetry is not prose that has been decorated and embellished, but prose is poetry that has been put upon a Procrustean bed of logic.
Yes.
And so what's interesting here is this sort of exploration of this thing we may be thinking of as communication as a kind of dancing description between us. I'm describing my experience, you're describing your experience, but my description is about, is this abductive richness. Anyway, I was hearing a lot of that and what was going on between the species in your music tonight, and I just wanted to bring up description.
Yeah, we hope those different species were describing us as we were like in the face of them, that somehow what they did ended up describing us by changing what we were doing.
Well, there's a way in which, Gregory talked about how if I'm in the same room as you and I'm looking at your face, I'm making my nervous system is making a description of you or of whatever it is that you are, and my habits and my predispositions and my learnings and my evolution are making that description. And you hear a sound and you react to it, and maybe your action may be sort of an imitation, but it's an imitation colored by your predilections, your presuppositions, which are unconscious, which are usually unconscious, which are more complex than you can ever describe if you tried to describe them. I mean, the simplest form of duo improvisation or group improvisation is simply two people trying to mirror each other or imitate each other. And I'm sure you've all tried the dance exercise like this, you know, two people just stand there mirroring each other's bodies and slowly move around in some way. And of course, you do this for just about 5 seconds. And of course, you both start cracking up laughing because you realize that you're honestly trying to imitate somebody else, or to use another word, describe what they're doing with your actions. And of course, you never can. And of course, it's colored by you. My impression of you is colored by me, and your impression of me is colored by you. And what we're doing is passing back and forth this incredibly complex transcoloration, you know, of each other's perceptions. And here you are, musicians, doing this in real time, very fast, much faster than consciousness can process. And it's really interesting. You're in this big bouillabaisse together, and it has a certain flavor. And it's my presuppositions plus David's presuppositions plus those of everybody that we've ever met and heard and played with, back to our teachers and our teachers' teachers' teachers, all the way back to the protozoa. And it's just absolutely marvelous to play 5 minutes of music and have the whole history of living existence back to the protozoa be present in those 5 minutes, and to welcome them in and to recognize that you really don't know what you're doing. And the more you don't know what you're doing, the better off you are, really.
Do you think music does that more than talking together, or poetry, or is there something particular to music that includes this journey back to the protozoa more?
Oh, I think any medium can include it.
Mm-hmm.
Can include it. Yesterday in the conference, somebody was showing photographs of fungal chairs, which I found to be absolutely gorgeous.
Who's supposed to sit in those chairs?
Yes, I'd love to sit in those chairs and see what it feels like. But yes, it can be done in any media. I mean, there's something, one particularly, of course, I mean, I'm saying it because I'm a musician. So obviously I'm carrying around my biases. I like fooling around with musical instruments. And there is something about the nonverbal, you're not constrained by meanings and definitions, and the immediacy and the fact that you can talk on top of each other without being rude, you know, and that's really nice. But I believe that regardless of your medium, you know, music, dance, film, poetry, sports, craftsmanship, pottery, whatever it may be. Read Pythagoras. I've read that I have to say, Michael Jacob is saying wonderful performance regarding Pythagoras. I'd rather that every time I hear the word he, we have to make sure that we're saying he or she, because we actually have no idea who Pythagoras was, or as Gregory called him, Pythagoras. I've read that he heard the music of the spheres in a meditative state, so perhaps he was in fact dancing around the same circle from the Frost poem. Exactly. Yes.
Joanna has a question, perhaps.
Can I speak?
Yes.
Okay, because yesterday I was echoing. Okay, so recently I've been really impressed by an article by an activist. Her name is Hannah de Jager, and she says that we focus too much on knowing the knowledge that we try to describe, I think, has to do a lot with description, like Nora just said. And we forget about loving, which is another way of knowing, of a relation with the known, which is just being together. And I was thinking about it when I heard you playing sort of with the bird. And the crucial notion in this loving relationship with other being is that you have to let it be. So it was very well illustrated by your musical piece that that you had to let be the other being in order to know its rhythms, and then to synchronize and elaborate and be with the other being with your rhythms. And that's why I think music has really, maybe has it easier, because those rhythms are so present. So I think it's from Kim McLaren, the letting other be, this very, very important concept. Thank you for this.
That's wonderful. And you're connecting it with love is really important. You know, to let another being be is to love that being and to learn from that being. A question in the chat is from Peter. Do you find that animals pick up on particular patterns of musical expression? Do they tend to react more to repeated melodic motifs, rhythmic patterns, pitch contours, musical gestures? Do you think they react emotionally out of curiosity that your music is a novel sound in their environment?
So I teach courses, I taught courses on music psychology and neuroscience. And, you know, there are various ways that music affects us, you know, emotionally, cognitive, motivationally, levels of arousal, can drive our motor systems. We use it in about 20 or 30 different ways. A lot of those ways we have in common with animals. And so do you find that if you play, say, rhythmic music, do they bob, you know, like Snowball the Cockatoo, do they bob their
Yeah, I was just thinking of the cockatoos when you said that.
Yeah. So in some ways, it gives us a little bit of insight into their umwelts and psychological worlds to see what kinds of musical sounds, patterns affect them in different ways.
Well, for me, and I'd love to hear what David says, because he's been doing this for years. I mean, my experience, my best experiences in terms of trying to actually see what I think an animal is reacting to has been with dogs over the years, simply because, you know, dogs can look into your eyes and you see so clearly what is interesting to them.
They have that allelomimetic howling response.
Yes, absolutely. And so I have to say, like, for example, I mentioned in the video that I was playing with my Grand Beagle, who's sitting upstairs right now. And I would try, like, I knew that he was responding to me and I was responding to him. But if I tried repeating the last thing that I did, because, oh, that must have been it, or what was it? Like, I remembered one time I was down here and I was actually playing some Bach, practicing, and I heard him up there singing along. So I said, oh, that's it. So I ran up and tried to do it again. And he wasn't interested at all then. And so when I've tried repeating things that I think get a response from him, that doesn't work. It's really,
Maybe you, his love of you and not the particular music.
That could well be. So David, what do you find with the nightingales in Berlin?
Well, I think all the things that Peter suggested happen sometimes, just like with different people. Like all kinds of different responses can happen. Each creature is really an individual. They're liable to do something you don't expect. You know, once you think you've got it figured out, they'll do something else. But I do think that I often feel that when you're playing music with some different species, different being there, when they understand that it's kind of music and not your language, they respond very differently. They realize it opens up towards something they might be able to understand or relate to, which I think helps to suggest, you know, promote this argument that Stephen Mythen had in his book, The Singing Neanderthal, where he's an archaeologist, and he argued that, you know, it's quite likely that the way Neanderthals communicated was much closer to music than to what we call language, just like much of the rest of animals that have evolved. Like music is more prevalent in nature than language, because communication is happening in a kind of emotional, structured and patterned way without always saying specific things that can be deciphered.
Yeah, Herbert Spencer said similar things, that music's very similar to the prosodic aspects of language, and that the prosodic aspects are common across large parts of the animal kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, cooing is affiliative, you know, woo, and grunting and barking is aggressive, you know, rah! You know, and basically you can get these sorts of basic responses out of a huge range of animals. But thank you for your performance.
Thank you. Yes, it's getting late. It's just in the mid-afternoon for me here in Virginia, but it's getting late for you folks in Europe. So
yeah, Daniel's giving us the signal. It's time to shut down here at NAV.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for being so patient and lasting on into the night. And we're so happy to have made this little performance for you, and also to appear live and to really be there. So thanks everyone for being there. And one day we'll do this all in person.
We will indeed. So thank you all and good night.
Thanks a lot. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Night, everyone.